Alright, so the first thing we want to do is open up Blender, and the basic Blender file is fine, but we're going to delete that cube because we do not need it. The next thing we want to do is set up our workspace to make it easier for us to track certain things like faces. Now you'll notice here at the bottom I've got a little note that gives me my vertices, faces, tries, objects. We want to make sure that we can see that because it'll help us to kind of judge where our model is. So we can do that by going to Edit, Preferences, and then under Preferences you go to Interface, Status Bar, Scene Statistics. And this will set it up to where you can see how many vertices, faces, and tries your model has. So the next thing I want to do is download a model. So I do 3D modeling. It is a very different workflow than prepping them for digital. So we'll talk about some of the differences about that and what you'll have to look out for. Just be respectful when you're getting 3D models. Make sure you have the rights to use them the way you're intending to. There's only a Creative Commons note. If they have attribution, remixing, attribution allowed, things like that, you'll see things like that. Make sure you kind of get a feel for that. And when in doubt, you can always ask the model creator what they want. I think a lot of model creators would be thrilled to know that someone's trying to convert their models over. I can say if someone converted my models over, I'd be like, oh please, please do them and paint them so I don't have to. As long as you give me the file so I can share it on my social media site and say, hey look, this, I'll attribute it to you as having created it, but that way other people can use and share it outside of just a small group. So keep that in mind as you're going through. So, but I'll pull a model that I did, and I'll pull a relatively complex one. So I'm going to import an STL file. I'm going to go to my Downloads folder, and let's pull my mole with caracals. So this is a fun model from Dark Sun that I did, because there's not a lot of Dark Sun models. And you'll see the first problem is he's way over there. Well, this is the origin. This is the center of my workspace, and he's hanging out over there. This is because when models are worked in 3D printing, sometimes their final corrections are done in the slicing software, which then orients them to the print bed, not to the center of this geometry. So, easy fix. We just go to Object, set Origin to the center of mass, or volume, really just, you got options here, but really either of these is the center of the object. And we take that and then we just put him back location to 0, 0 on the XY. Z, he's fine, there he is on the Z-axis, we'll just leave him. And then to make sure all of that is in place, we can go to Object, Apply, All Transformations. And this basically says, hey, make sure that is where he is in space, and that'll be his new home. Alright, so now that we've got that, we have a second problem, and it's that he has a base. I hate this base. I made it, I put them on here. I hate them a lot. I have this original model where the feet are separate from the base, but for purposes of this video, I think it's good to see how to get the base separated out. So if you have a model you like and they've got a base on there, well, technically you can do it with the base intact and just hide the base by tucking it into the thing in TaleSpire, but this base has a rim, which means you'll probably have that rim sticking up and it's obnoxious. Plus, it's polys, which counts, it's the faces you don't need, so we're going to get rid of them. So to do that, we're going to go into object mode. We're going to take the object and go into edit mode. Ooh, look at those triangles. So we can see how complex this model is. He's got a ton of tiny triangles. It's so pretty. It's glowing. But we don't want him to glow, so by the end of this he won't be. Alright, so we are going to take him and do a bisect. So if you don't have anything selected and he looks all black, make sure you just hit the A on your keyboard. He'll light up like a Christmas tree. And another thing you might want to consider is this little widget is your control widget in Blender for directions. Hit the X, maybe the Y, and it'll sort of align you to the Z-axis you can see flat on. Now we want to bisect. We want to basically cut the base away. You can do it manually, but it's a pain in the butt. I don't recommend it. Let's just bisect it away. So we go to Mesh, Bisect. Now it doesn't matter what you do here because it's never going to be what you want. I'll show you how to fix it. So I'm just going to draw a line wherever. Alright, so cutting straight across. And the bisect tool will likely be tucked away as if you don't want these options. You absolutely do. Click there, expand the options. This is how you get your bisect where you want it. By default, it probably will look like this, where neither of these are checked. And you'll see something like that. You want to check fill. That makes sure it actually puts a plane where it does the cut. And you want to select clear inner, or depending on if you swipe the other direction, it might be clear outer. Clear outer gets rid of the the arrow facing direction and vice versa. So you just toggle them so you get what you want. Obviously, I don't want to cut them off at the ankles, so we're going to adjust these. I'm going to set the plane point to be 0 for x and y, and for z, that's going to essentially be where it makes the cut. So leave that as is, we'll adjust that in a second, but I want it to be on a flat line, not this wonky angle, so that's going to be a 0, and a 1. Alright, so now I can kind of see where it wants to do the cut. And this is successful, it definitely cut it off, but I might try to see if I can get a little more of the feet in there. They're already a little flat because of how I did the model. So let's see if I do let's do 1.6. Oh, that got me the base back in there. Foo. Alright, so let's do a 1.65. Not quite. Let's see if I can get a different angle on it. It's not want to play nice with me. I think I played around with this earlier. I think 1.69 was my sweet spot. Yep. Good enough. So we just click off of that and it'll execute that function. And now the feet are filled in and they're separate from that base. But we've got this ring to deal with. Easy fix. You can grab part of it and you can hit Control+ on the numpad and it'll sort of select up connected vertices. It's a helpful trick in general, but it doesn't save us here because it's a little taxing on the system and everything we want is connected. So we can just grab any part of it and go to Mesh, select, linked. So everything that's touching it gets selected. Delete key, delete, and it really doesn't matter which of these you choose. Delete faces, and we are set. So now we've got our model nice and clean. We'll go back to object mode and look at him. Ooh, look, he's all nice and separate. Hooray. Okay, so now let's go to our next step. Alright, so the next step will really depend on your model, and that is mesh cleanup. When we're designing meshes for 3D printing, our goal is detail and polys and texture and making sure we've got conveyance between the size of this mini. So if you're like, wow, its hands are huge, those caracals are huge. Well, when you're looking at the gaming table, if they're any smaller than that, they're going to break, and they're not going to convey really well. So 3D printed models often are things are thick, like these armbands are huge, because they need to be able to be seen in printing when they're 3D printed, and they need to be able to be painted. That's okay. For TaleSpire, I think it works well with the aesthetic of the other things in TaleSpire. That's not so much a cleanup bit as just a commentary. But if we want to understand cleanup, I can say, wow, this model looks pretty darn good. I'm familiar with it, though, so I know that it's not the best thing in the world. So we're going to tell, how do you know if a model needs some TLC cleanup? Well, if I'm looking at my model, it looks alright, and if I go inside of it, it looks okay, but there's some funkiness going on. So you'll notice some things like this. So at some point, this got all interconnected. So it thinks that this is like a ring going through the object, and it certainly isn't. There's also some unnecessary areas, like this space here shouldn't really even exist because it's not part of what we would need. It just kind of goes into the model in a weird way. There's also a spot back here, like where if you look at it and you're doing a little inspection, you'll see that all the triangles are a little funky. And if I go to view in, sorry, not 3D, but the triangle, I don't want transparency. Look there, there's like this weird funk going on there. I remember why that happened. There's also like a hole here, which makes sense, but if you actually go into the model, it kind of extends out in some weird ways. So if you have a model with torn clothes where there might be holes, you might notice some of these things more. Little patches like that that are going to cause some trouble going along. You don't have to do a full inspection. In truth, most of these steps are for a perfectionist who really wants those models to not have any issues when they're doing their painting, which you might get a minor like fleck of paint in the wrong spot because of doing the UVs, things like that. This isn't a big deal, but I'm going to go ahead and describe how do you start cleaning up some of those funky issues and maybe only spend 5 minutes on it, so you're not dedicating as much time to that as you are to actually doing the low poly. Alright, but since I'm me, we're going to do some quick fixes. So the first thing you can do, and you can do this to any model, is give it a good old-fashioned remesh. Now remeshing will fix basic issues. It can introduce a few, but it does fix a lot of stuff where there's confounded geometries. It basically says, hey, let me look at this model, get a feel for what it's like, and put a grid over it. And that's what your new model is. So if we go into the modifiers, so that's the one that looks like a little wrench, and we go to something like remesh, we notice that this makes the model, it makes it kind of gummy, but the basic voxel remesh does fix a lot of weird issues. So if we look at the back of him, where that little spot was, it's kind of smoothed all that out. There's not like a weird patch there anymore. And even on the inside, where we had those funky areas, it's taken those and they're gone. It's sort of imagined that dimple as just a dimple. It says, okay, that's not a whole big weird interior thing. It's also fixed this back here, where behind the ring there was a sort of weird thing. So it's really done a lot of correction. The problem with the default remesh, which is the voxel remesh, is that you have these, it makes your lines gummy. And by that, I mean, like, let's say where these rings hit this guy's arm, it's now kind of sloped and weird. It doesn't hold it sharp. So there's also other options. Now, the other remesh options of Blocks and Smooth I'm not as big a fan of, but if we go to the sharp one, ooh, look, it's terrible. But not really. What we want to do is increase the depth. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the depth. And here's the problem. This can be very taxing on your system. So just know as you go up, it's going to make your system hate you a little bit. I go up to a 9. You might have to go and take a tea break depending on what kind of your computer you have. But that, oh, that is lovely. It doesn't look like I lost any of the quality of the model, but it kept the sharpness, which I like. So we've got these nice sharp edges. And if we go inside the model, let's see, how did it handle those areas that I knew were kind of problematic? Oof, it didn't handle this quite as well as the other version, but we can do a little editing there. And how did it handle that other area that I was aware of? Note this down a little bit further. Yeah, there's still some funk there, but we can clean that up. I prefer this because, once again, we've done it is fixing a lot of other issues. So let's start there with our first issue fix. So we apply that, and now we've got this. The next thing is maybe doing just a little bit of cleanup. There, you can get really persnickety with sculpting and editing the mesh tile by tile. I've done that to fix models, but we're going to do the fast and loose version of this, which is, I know this is a problem spot, I know I want to fix it. Let me just kind of scoot over to it. And I am going to cheat. I'm going to go into sculpt mode, and I'm going to select the smoothing brush. And I'm going to make it pretty strong. Let's make it not so big. And let's just smooth that area out. So now that makes that almost invisible. And I might even touch up a few other things in here while I'm in the model, just because I know they're not necessarily important. I can tag those. And let's see, where's that funky belt thing? Ah, here it is. Not the belt thing, it's up here. Phooey, so I'll tag all that. So there, kind of making that. And if I look on the outside, I lost a little bit of detail, maybe, but from Tailspire perspectives, no one's going to be like, oh my goodness, let me look at that. They're going to be up here looking at what's going on. Anyway, so just a little bit of touch up here, there. I think that might have been the only two major problem spots I had, but this is a good way to just kind of test your, start learning Blender if you feel like it. Do a little bit there. I know that some of this is unnecessary, but, since I'm here, just, there. Done. Alright, so it doesn't mess up too much, keeps it simple, and we'll go from there. So, now that I've done some very basic cleanup, and, sorry, I'm looking around, because I can't leave well enough alone, this area here, I just want to that's all messy. I'll smooth that out. There. Much better. Okay. So now that I've got that cleaned up, and I don't even want to look at the hands, do I? Do I look at the hands? No, it's hard to get into the hands. We'll just trust that whoever modeled this thing did a good job at making the hands. Alright, so get rid of the multi-res. I don't know why it makes that modifier. Alright, so now we've done a little bit of cleanup. The model should be much better for decimation now. So let's get out of sculpt mode and go back to object mode. Let's make a copy of this model. And we're going to call this the original. We're going to call this next one, actually before we get too fancy with this, we want to have this one be our high poly model. So let's just go ahead and make that our high poly one. We're going to make one other fix to it. And that is that the triangles aren't triangles yet. So when we do a remesh, it does it by a grid. So in edit mode, we see that these are grids. There's a lot of them. Oh my goodness, what did I do to this thing? Oh, I made this. Oh, it's not too much. Actually, it's actually a lot less faces than I had before after doing the remesh. This is actually only a 329,000 mesh. That's actually that's light by STL standards. Anyway, we're going to triangulate it. So to do that, we go into edit mode, hit A to select everything, go to face, triangulate faces. All right, that's what I'm thinking we're looking at. There's my over 500,000 face count. Now we're cooking with good STL gas. Let's go back to object mode. All right, so that's our high poly model. Let's get rid of our original model. That's going to be a fun model to work with. So now we're going to take this guy and make him low poly. So Control C, Control V. Let's label him low poly. Okay. Now with our low poly model selected, I'm going to start decimating. Now my favorite form of decimate is, for this purpose, planar. So if you go into decimate, you have options. Collapse is great, but it's not going to solve all your problems. Go to planar. Now, planar decimate takes a while to run. What it's doing is it's looking at, sorry, making sure I'm hiding the other models so they're not confusing. It's going to look at, based on an angle, how to break down these surfaces. So you'll see how it's like this area that's mostly flat, well, it knows it can reduce all of the triangulated faces there into one single face. This isn't triangulating our faces, which can cause a little bit trouble later, but that's okay, we'll fix it. But we're going to start with that, and you can see that we dropped our faces down to 116,000 from 600 and something thousand. So that's a good start, so we're going to do that. To make it more aggressive, we can also up the angle it does it at. So if I go back and go to that decimate and go to planar, and I make this even just like a 6%, let's do it that way, then it's going to lower our face count. Wow. To 93. That like cut it in half. Ooh, yeah, I like that. Let's start there. And when we're looking at this model, we see that we haven't lost a lot. Like, it's still very much that model. Let's do that again. Let's go to 7%. Oh man. Look at us cutting them faces down. Wait. Seems like that's more than before. Oh, no, it's less. Just not as many. You don't get as much bang for your buck over time with that, but that gives us a good start. So now let's do a little classic decimation. And let's cut this in half. So let's do a 0.5. I like iterative decimation over doing it all at once. There's reasons for that. It comes out of some classic control things with how systems, if you do it in iteration, sometimes do better than doing it all at once. Alright, so I'll accept that. Looks good still. Let's decimate again. Let's cut it in half again. Now you'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm going well under. So right now I'm at 27k verts. I have found that because of how the models get exported, that they can only, while TaleWeaver can take models of up to 60k, the model that you export isn't just the mesh vertices. There's a lot of other pieces that sort of play into that. So I find that if I'm keeping my normals and things intact to feed into TaleWeaver, I really need this model, the poly count, to be much lower. So I'm going to go and apply that. Now I'm down to 27,000.
Oh man, let's see. Can we get anything else out of a planar decimate? Probably not. Maybe if I go to like another 7%. Or, oh man, yeah, I don't know. That gets me 25 versus 27. It scrapes a little off the top. Let's do it. And let's go back to a classic decimate. 0.5 again. Alright, now we're looking blocky. That's kind of what I would expect to see. That's the kind of model that you want. Alright, and that puts my faces down to 16, that puts my verts down to 12. You'll see that it will go back up when you do your import, but we're going to stop there. So if you think this is too chunky, back up from it a little bit. You got a lot of detail there. And it is chunky, but it's, you know, it's chiseled jaw. So I'll do accept, apply. Now we need to do a little bit of cleanup to the model. Alright, so to clean up the model, you'll notice we've got these little flecks. Those little flecks indicate to me that there's some stray edges, there's some stray stuff going on that are just going to be a problem. So we are going to fix them now. So we're going to go into edit mode. We're going to select our entire object. We also want to make sure our faces are triangulated. You notice we've got these big spaces. They will not play nice. So we are going to take that face and we are going to triangulate faces. Perfect. That did up our face count and up our vert count a bit, but we'll get there. So now with everything selected, we're going to do some cleanup. So in Blender, there's some defaults here. You go to Mesh, Cleanup. We want to delete anything loose. And as you can see, we removed about 300, almost 400 vertices, some edges that were just kind of hanging out and not in use. The next thing we want to do is consider merging some things. So you'll notice you've got little patches where there's little bitty pieces all together. They really aren't necessary. They're not really serving the model in any way. We want to clean those up a bit. So we'll just select A again and go to Mesh, Cleanup, and we're going to go to Merge by Distance. By default, this is really tiny. So we're going to actually up that considerably. Ooh, look at that. And it's going to remove 1,600 something vertices, but it removed them from spaces that had little tight packs. Now, I can look around and be like, oh man, did I take out something I wanted? I don't know, like it looks pretty good. So we'll call it, and that's that cleanup. So what we've done is we did Mesh, Cleanup, Merge by Distance, we did Mesh, Cleanup, Delete Loose. I might just do another Delete Loose, because when we did that one cleanup, it created some other loose. So let's grab it all again, Mesh, Cleanup, Delete Loose, there's nothing else loose, good. Okay, Mesh, Cleanup, and by Distance, nothing was removed, good. Mesh. It has fill holes. I never trusted its fill holes, so I was, you can click it, but you're probably not going to get anywhere. And I'm just going to make sure the face is triangulated and triangulate them again. They should be fine, but it's just a good double check. Alright, so now we have our low poly model. It's looking good. Go back into object mode. That's pretty good. We're looking at 10K verts, 21K faces. That's solid. So from here, we want to take this guy and do the next step. So our next step is going to be make what I call a floofy version. So what we're doing is we're taking the low poly model and we're making what's called a low poly cage. So I'm going to Control C, Control V to get my second one, low poly, and we're going to label it our cage. The cage basically says when we are projecting out the normals, it sort of acts as an encapsulation for that. There's some technical things about it that I probably could not explain well, so I won't try. But we're going to take this low poly cage and we're going to hide our other one. And well, actually, let's get the high poly model. We want to see that one. And let's take the low poly cage as our thing, and we're going to go to edit mode with it. In edit mode, hit A to select all, and you can hit Alt S to open up this option of floofing and shrinking, or you can use this tool over here, which is the shrinking and fattening tool. So if you click that versus that, and you get a little handle, and you can kind of poof it up, shrink it down, poof it up, shrink it down. We want to get him floofy. We want him just floofy enough to cover the base model. So if you look at the handle of the axe,
you'll see how when I'm expanding it, I get a lot covered for everything else. So if I stop there, he looks well covered, but I saw a little bit of that peeking through. Actually, maybe I didn't capture it at the right second, but for a minute there I saw it, and I wasn't really confident about it. So we floofed him up just a little bit more. So floof, you don't want to floof too much. Too much floof isn't good. Just enough floof. There. I could probably do it here with the offset, but that'd be a smart decision, and we're not making smart decisions today. All right, so that's my floofed model, and that's all I need to do with it. Floofed normals, floofed cage. We're going to exit out, go back to object mode. We don't need the cage to be visible anymore, so we can close that. So in essence, we've got our high poly model, our low poly model, and our cage, which is all floofy. We're going to focus back on the low poly model. What we want to do is we're going to create our UV map of it, and then from that we'll create our normals. So one thing to keep in mind is this guy, right now we have some nice hard edges. It'll come back into play during texture painting. We're going to do a fast and loose UV map. We're not going to be doing anything crazy, special, or making it fancy. But we want to change the shading on this guy. So we can go to just a shade smooth, which looks clunky. But it's supposed to. This will make sense when you see it in TaleWeaver. The TaleWeaver default model, you'll look at him, he looks kind of like this, very gummy, like a sort of thing. You can also do shade auto smooth. This works well if your model's good for it. You might notice some funk. This, I think, actually works decent, but I've got a little funk here on the nose. I can go in and do some tweaking of the mesh to make that better, but shade smooth is fine, so just leave it like that and don't freak out that it looks like a chewed pile of gum. So from here, we'll go into UV editing. So from here, it normally opens you in edit mode if you don't see it like this. If it looks like this, just go into edit mode. Hit A to select your entire mesh. I've goofed around in this, so that's why this doesn't look like it will on yours. This won't have anything here. And now we're going to create a Smart UV Project, which is the second option under UV. The default settings here are what you're going to stick with when you're doing this sort of fast and loose method, so I'm just going to hit OK. And what we're looking at here now is all of these sort of facets kind of flattened out, like if I were to take this and cut it into pieces of paper and try to lay it out flat. That's what Blender tries to do. It sort of creates a flat version of all these pieces. Now, if you're familiar with 3D modeling for digital environments, you know that this is a really not the best UV unwrap. Like I said, if you're really going to get into texture painting, you're going to want to do things like creating edge seams and vertex groups, things like that. I'll probably cover that at a different time because it's something I'm going to do while I do my models. But for just trying to get something going and explain the whole process, this is a good place to start at just getting the basics together and worry about perfecting it later. So we've got that. Next thing we want to do is do the shading, and this is where we'll actually create our normals. So from the UV editing tab, we go to the shading tab. Now, there's a lot going on here. We're not worried about this or this. These are the only windows we're really worried about. So we'll just kind of get those where we can see them. This will be blank because I was playing earlier. We just want to make sure we've got the low poly cage selected, and we're going to hit new to create a new material. So I'm going to create this and be the mole mat. Okay, so my mole material. And from here, I also want to add a node. So if I right-click this space, click onto the space and right-click, and then go to search by image, we're going to add an image texture. You can also get there by make sure you click onto the white space, the black space, right-click and go to add. It'd be under texture, it'd be image texture, so you can find it there. But there's a lot of options here, so I say use the search bar, and ultimately you've got your image texture node. In the image texture node, you're going to create a new texture. So we're going to call this our mole normal, and hit OK. We'll leave the default settings. Now, the next thing we want to do is set up the scene. Normally this will be on modifiers or whatever you're on last. You want to go up to your render properties, which is different from your scene properties. So just render properties,
for the scene. It gets a little confusing because some of the verbiage is used again, but so render properties, which will open up your scene. The render engine by default is Eevee. We're going to change that to cycles because that lets us bake our normals. Then down here, the option for bake, we're going to make some settings here. So we don't need to worry about most of these. What we do want to do is go to this setting, and by default I believe it is closed, but you'll do selected to active and hit that. You'll want to checkbox the cage, so if this is collapsed, just unfold it with the arrow and choose your cage object, low poly cage, check. We also want to change our bake type from combined to normal. So that way it knows it's baking out the normals using the selected to active models and using the mole low poly cage as our cage. So note on the cage, it has to be based off our low poly model because it has to have the exact same faces and vertices. So make sure that if you're like playing around with this, just know that the cage has to be built off the low poly model after it's been cleaned. Otherwise you'll get some errors. So now we want to unhide our high poly model and we want to select it and then hold down Control on our keyboard and select the low poly model. And you'll see that there's some overlap and these little lines show up, and that's normal. The goal is that the high poly model that was selected first should be in the darker orange, the low poly model selected second should be in the light orange, and this will open up where you are here. With this selected and those selected, now we can hit bake. And it's going to bake our normals. It should do it fairly quickly. And look, we've got normals over here. Isn't that fancy? So this looks like what I would expect. It's exactly what I would expect, so that's good. And now we can export them. So we've basically done all we're going to do until we want to texture paint. So we're going to go to here, we're going to take this image, and we're going to save it as, and I'm going to go into my downloads folder and save it as my mole normal PNG. Go for an RBGA, get rid of the compression. At one point I nailed these settings that Unity loved them and just accepted them as is, but fortunately Unity will do some correction if it's not the format that it wants. So don't overstress with these settings. PNG, RBGA, sRGB color space is fine. It'll accept it, it'll work. So we'll save that image. Now under the layout again, let's go here and let's hide that high poly model. We don't want it. We just want the low poly model, which is all blurry. And we're going to go to here and we're going to export this one as an object. So wavefront object, and just default settings tend to work okay, but if your default settings aren't this, just make sure you got the geometry, UV coordinates, and normals. You actually don't need anything else, so this is enough. This will do it. So let's go ahead and take that to my downloads folder, moles caracols, export object. Alright, so let's see what this looked like in TaleWeaver. Alright, so we've opened up TaleWeaver Lite, and the default shows the guy, kind of like what I was showing you before. He's kind of gummy looking, so back to not fretting. I'm not very good at controlling this thing, so don't fret. If they look a little gummy, that's normal. Now we're going to import. So let's import our assets, import new asset, go to my downloads folder, so that's where I saved them, mole object mole normal, import. Alright, so let's get that to be our new model. He's turned around, so let's just flip him a bit. Let's see, it's a -90. Then he's facing forward. So he looks chunky, just like I said he would, but I'm not too worried about it. Now we'll add in our normal texture. Now when we select this, it'll probably be a little upset. Oh, it looks awful. Don't worry about it. Now we'll just hit this button for attempting to change the texture. I've tried other exports. There's probably someone, I'll figure it out and I'll update this video with a little clip that explains it, but right now this should fix it. Boop. Oh look, it did. So yeah, look at that. It's beautiful. So we've got a 21K poly count on our vertexes, and overall it looks pretty darn good. This is unpainted. Now there's a few things you might say, oh, I see like a little bit of a line here and there. You're going to get that, but for the most part, you're not going to be up in the grill of the minis a super amount a lot, and it really is pretty darn good. I'm terrible at this controls, I don't know why I bother. So there is, I mean, that's only 21K poly vertex count. That is looking great. It doesn't look like the low poly model at all. It looks like a nice high poly model. Other things we can do, so let me just get to where I can see this guy a little better. Alright. Alright. There we go. Watch me struggle. Good enough. Alright, so the other thing I'd say is the paint wash covers a lot. That just adds that sort of a matte look to match the other minis in the game. It also will cover up a lot of sort of funk that you might see on your model. So if you feel like you've got a few lines, little low poly areas, hit that. It covers a lot, as will when you paint the model. So we'll talk about texture painting either as a supplement to this or as a secondary one. But if you don't have your model painted, and we might do a quick demo, but if you don't have your model painted, I hang on to a bunch of 2D textures that are just handy, like a flat wood texture, a wooden cork texture, just to have something to put on the model, just to give it something in game. I always like the idea of having sort of a carved wooden mini being a thing. It works. Even a flat wood texture can work, or flat, like just anything. We'll sell the mini in game, depending on what you're using it for. If you got minions or big fights coming, you might get a little fancy, but there's nothing wrong with just a flat gray mini as a representative piece. Now, the rest of these settings are covered extensively, so I'll just stick into the video here with the low poly thing. And we'll pop back into Blender real quick and just see the basics of texture painting. We'll talk about a more advanced look at texture painting second. So I said I'd talk about just a quick fast and loose texture painting. So this is where you've got your model and you're like, okay, I want to paint it. I want it to look good. Well, use this file that you set up. I should save it to make sure it's there. Okay, paint blend. Save Blender file. The thing you want to keep in mind is you'll have to do an adjustment to your shading. So let's go back to shading. Now we have our normals because we created them earlier. But we want to connect the normals to our material that's on this guy, because that's going to make painting it easier. So we'll add another node here, and we're going to add a, I don't remember what it is, so I'm just going to look up normal map. Drop the normal map in there, and basically we're going to tell Blender, hey, this normal image, use the colors from it that you exported to give this thing its normal map. Perfect. I'm going to make the base color something I can deal with, like a gray. Okay, so that gets that started, and I know there's some tweaky settings that I'll be playing with here, but if we go in then to texture paint, we want, oh wait, let's get us a new image here. Open image. Alright, let's go back into shading. Let's do a image. Add texture. Texture. New. I'll do, this is null color. Okay. And we'll make that our base color. Boop. And that will give us something to play with. And so now if we go into texture painting, we'll do mul color. By default it's black. Let's see here. I'm trying to remember exactly how I made this happen. It's not applying my normals the way it should be. If you look, it still looks really blurry. Let's pop into my modeling layout view. Let's look at it in this mode. Ooh, look at that. That's awful. So let us see. What have I done wrong here? Let's shade flat. No, that's not going to get us there. Shade smooth. Basically, what I'm seeing is that it's having the same issue interpreting the normals that it made as our file. Now I remember. We're going to go back into shading. We're going to go here, and we're going to make the color space linear. That's the ticket. So Blender likes the linear color space, and now if we go into texture paint, oh, really? There we go. Not this view. This view. I forget what it's called. Viewport shading versus, well, anyway. This is the one you want. The one that has the little X on it. Shows the materials. Alright, and over here, we've got our mul color. Default is black. Let's get a nice, so I'm just going to do, like, this is what I call the fast and loose paint job. So let's get a nice base skin tone, since this guy's not wearing a lot of clothes. Let's go for, skin tones are tough. We'll go for something that looks like he's been out in the sun a bit. We'll do that. Fill. Oof, of course, it didn't keep my color. Maybe because I picked a different tool. Yeah, it's because I picked a different tool. second half of this video is watch me struggle with paint tools. Alright, so got our base color. Now everything else in this is, you can get really professional with it, and I'll talk about some of those things. But for the most part, you just take your draw tool, you can adjust the radius, you can adjust the strength if you want, you can adjust the way it's mixed, whether it's blended, molded. There's a lot of great options here. But let's just say I want the loincloth to be red. I can just take my little red here, and I can just paint it. It's just like spray painting it. Now, and then this is, like I said, this is the sort of the fast and loose version. You'll see that there's like red going everywhere, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. But like I said, fast and loose. And maybe his helmet will be red too, just something. We got red paint everywhere. That's okay. He's been busy. I can embrace that as an arena effect. And let's get a little bone color on the axes, because it's a metal-free world. It's tricky to get a good bone color. It's a little more white. There, that'll do. Now, obviously, if you're doing this, spend more time on it. I'm just showing you that this is the function you can use. Now, it's all over the place. Let me get his eyes a little bit too. A little bit smaller. Always feels good to have something look decent-ish. And I'll give them. This is not my best work. But let's back away from the model. It's also not, it's pretty rough. It's pretty terrible, let's be honest. But my point here is, you'll notice we've got all this stray paint going everywhere. I can try to just blend and blur some of it out. This effect, these little scratch marks essentially, are the result of us not spending a lot of time making our UV map. So when we didn't spend a lot of time making our UV map, it kind of guessed where everything is, and they're all really close. So if we're zooming in here, we see that if we start painting, let's just take something like bright blue, and we can also paint over here, by the way. So go here, let's pick out a nice bright garish bluish color, like that. And let's paint this thing bright blue. Let's see, what did that paint? Find something. Oh, right there on the head. But chances are it bled. See, it bled here, and it bled here. That's because this is here, and this part is over here. Now you're like, well, why? Well, you're blurring it a lot. Well, I am, but see how some of these parts actually almost touch. So there's a bit of bleed that occurs naturally, where it wants to go beyond the actual pixel border. This is to prevent there from being gaps and lines. There's a way to adjust it to where it shrinks that, but ultimately the true fix is to have your mesh be divided in a way that makes more sense. But if we're trying to just like kind of get something together quickly, you can do, and you have ones that don't have a lot of different colors, or bright colors that are going to show up, like you got some wearing all black and gray, then you're probably not going to notice it so much, and it's not going to be an issue. So just keep that in mind. If you're picking colors that work well together, then you're probably not going to have that issue. A little over paint there. Anyway, that's kind of how texture painting works. Very poorly. But, maybe he looks like he's ready to, witness me sort of moment. What else do I want to say about this other than it could be vastly improved by better UV mapping? Don't stress. It doesn't really matter. And let me see if I can find that setting and add that in. But otherwise, that's the basics of getting painting done. Oh, to export this, you would just go to Image and Image and Save As, and then just save it and export it and import it into TaleWeaver. Alright, it took me a second or two, but what I was looking for is here under the brush options, and it may be the same for all of these, but what I'm looking for is something called bleed. So you've got options here. You can create a color palette, by the way, which can be really nice if you're wanting to keep the same colors together.
So like you've got a skin tone, you want to pull that back out. The one you're looking for is this bleed 2 pixels. So if I reduce that to 1 pixel, I'll see a little less, no pixels. Then you're gonna see, so if I take this fill and let's just reset this whole thing, and oh, we filled the whole thing there. Let's go to full black just to go back. Oh, see, now it's not gonna, I don't have bleed anymore, and I painted that one directly, so. But, oh, it's actually a good example. Without any bleed present, you get these sort of funky lines between sections. You can sometimes sort of blur them out, but you'll notice the blur actually pulls paint around. So that may not work for you, but you can, let's try, like, if we do a bleed of, let's go back and do like a bleed of maybe 1 pixel. Now it can't be like a half pixel because we're working in pixels. But if we do that, we fill, and now let's see, that we don't have the lines. Let's see how painting works on an area that we know is funky, like the helmet. So go back here to paint, make sure my bleed's at 1, check. Let's pick a color that's bright just because it's easy to find. Go for like that color. Like, I don't know. I shouldn't spend this much time making a decision. We'll go with blue. And I'm painting that. Now, we're not seeing it as much. Let's pick something else. Let's do like a red on the loincloth. I think that's where we saw it. Red. We'll go for pink. No shame in a pink loincloth. Alright. And actually, you know what? This solved the problem. It's not the best in the world, but man, that is, we're not seeing that bleed go to other areas. Well, a little bit. You can adjust the bleed as you go. You can also just sort of, be kind of paint. If I paint back over that, does that affect this one as much? Not as much. It doesn't seem to, if it bleeds in reverse, it's like putting that line, I think, somewhere under here. So order of operations, just, I'd say, play with it. This is, I'm doing the sort of the MS Paint approach. One way to make it a little bit better, so let's say you've got, let me just do a full fill on this guy again. Can I get a full fill of a color I wanted? Like, kind of a brightish, oof, that's awful. So awful. Skin tones are hard. It's better. I'll start there. So, in terms of making things look decent, so I can do the MS Paint approach, and that's fine. Another thing you can do is really lower the strength of your brush. Change the mix type. Let's say I want to go to like a lighten, and let's make this just a lighter, slightly brighter color that I normally wouldn't choose. Only I want to do it on paint, so now I've got to change it up again. Let's stick with that. Go back to lighten, and that's a little too strong. Let's strengthen that down to like something like that. And what I can do is I can start painting highlights. A little more yellow, a little more light. And it's a little too aggressive. I need to lower the strength on that, maybe adjust some of the fallout from it. But we can start getting a little bit of depth here and there where I've got some light across the top of the arms, and start giving it a little bit more life and adding depth through the color that I might not get otherwise. This is also a good way to give other pieces a little bit more depth. So maybe you're not that great at painting, or you just don't want to spend a lot of time. Doing little washes of light and dark over surfaces can add a little bit of depth that is nice. So I'll do like that. And now what I'm going to do, that pulled it light, and it's not perfect, but like I said, it's just a demo. I want to go and do a multiply. And the multiply, I'm going to pick a darker. And now I'm going to, let's do a little split like that. I can go under and do some shading. Maybe get a little darkness around there, where those are. And now we can start kind of shadowing out areas to give a little bit of depth as well. And while not perfect, we start to see that bring a little bit more into the character. Now, this is a terrible example because I'm overdoing it. But if you take your time and kind of get into the rhythm of it, put on some music, this can actually be a lot of fun. Make him his eyes back. I feel silly he doesn't have his eyes anymore. Ooh. Make him not look so wide-eyed. I'll go ahead and fix it all later. But the principle's there. You just kind of paint, play, push back, push forward, and you just paint directly on your mini, essentially. Only without really tiny brushes that you're afraid of leaving in your water. So that is a terrible introduction to texture painting, but at least tells you what the next step is. Obviously, you can spend a lot of time here. It's very relaxing and methodical. And that is that. So actually, let's go ahead and export that image. Save as. We'll color in the downloads folder. And let's drop that into TaleWeaver and pretend like we know what we're doing. Assets. Import new asset. We'll color. And select, oh, not that one. Select this one. We'll color. Now, it shows up a lot darker here, you'll see. That's okay. Sometimes it's because of the paint wash. Sometimes you just have to kind of adjust your expectations and the colors you're using. So it's kind of good to see how it appears in TaleWeaver as you're working. You can go and just change the lightness of it just using like a photo edit program basic to Windows if you're like, that came out darker than I wanted or lighter than I wanted or whatever. But you can do those corrections there. This is interesting. Now you're probably wondering why I haven't talked about the metallic AO roughness texture. You know, if you're doing things with metals, this adds a whole other level of complexity. You'll kind of do the same thing you did here, but with other textures, and then select that image. Now, different things do different things here, things that make it look like metal. It's kind of just, you just have to play with it. There's some people, once I figure out a good method for it, it'll work out, and I'll tell you something about it. But for right now, unless you have things that are metal or glass, I think it looks great if you just leave it empty, because you're just going to have the default that are created by the paint wash, which is just a little, takes kind of the shiny off, gives it a little matte, which works for a lot of stuff. And that is the basics of texture painting, which is a really horrible introduction, but if you need to know the basics, that is the very, very basics. Alright, and that's it.